Hello, my name is Gerard Cortese. In this module, we will discuss France's World War II memory from 1940 to the present. For our agenda, we'll cover three main aspects: module overview, the time periods that cover French memory evolution during the war and throughout the post-war years, and a conclusion. This module will discuss French World War II memory and its evolution through the post-war decades. French national identity became divided through myth, politics, and culture, and the generational changes in later decades that added to its memory evolution. Evidence of these aspects will be explored through secondary sources of scholarly books and articles. After the social changes of the 60s and 70s, France's post-war identity evolved from the dark memory of its 1940 defeat and myth of the resistance to the memorialization of acceptance and respect that incorporated history into its national memory. 1940 to 1944 was known as the Dark Years, resulting from France's defeat in May 1940 and the German occupation. It was during this time in the war when French memory began to take shape. On July 10, 1940, the National Assembly of the new government, sitting at Vichy, voted extraordinary powers to the famous World War I hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. These powers gave Pétain almost unrestricted executive powers as head of French state, while making him known as the protector of France. The magnitude of a humiliating defeat set the stage for a memorial policy that attempted to erase these 4 years by covering up its defeats and offering a sensible and acceptable interpretation of the Dark Years. The Dark Years influenced a national narrative of France's World War II memory that would later focus on myth and legend over history and became a memory influenced by politics that would divide and fragment the nation, causing a national identity crisis for France throughout the post-war years. In August 1944, as Paris was liberated, and Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, gave a speech that downplayed the Allied lead in liberation. Paris liberated, liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the support and help of all of France. After the war, de Gaulle's speech played into myths to reinforce France's national identity with the self-liberation myth, a condition of anti-Americanism. This myth evolved from France having to be a third wheel to the Anglo-American allies during the Dark Years, and having been sidelined from decisions made at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. This position weakened French influence and had a significant effect on French post-war foreign policy. At the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, France turned to its reorganization and modernization. Charles de Gaulle became the president of the new provisional government from June 1944 to January 1946. De Gaulle's rhetoric after the war tended to sideline the French defeat by talking of the two global conflicts of 1914 to 1945 as forming a 30 years war against German aggression. This interpretation of the conflict would allow for a twist in history. This twist included the myths that covered up the Dark Years and dismissed the humiliation of German occupation, while the role played by the resistance was a prominent role that glorified French heroes, while also tying together the memory of World War II with the victories of the Great War. These myths attempted to reconstruct France's national identity by reuniting the French people and promoting French nationalism and pride. Throughout the 50s and into the 60s, the resistance continued to be the focal point of memory. The French government attempted to disassociate itself from the memory of Vichy by establishing its own authority. The challenges of decolonization in Indochina and Algeria, and the difficulties of the politics in the Cold War made adjustments to memory. These adjustments after the war were challenging and continued to demote the conflicts of 1940 to 1944. At the same time, the resistance myth's stranglehold on public and political opinion coexisted with a period of substantial economic expansion. This expansion generated a positive self-image and provided a sense of national cohesion, allowing for domination of French wartime experiences to be much easier to bear while masking history. The memorial policy of this time failed to celebrate the veterans of 1940, ignored almost 80,000 Jewish deportations, and the collaboration of the Vichy regime. In the late 1960s, while many countries protested the Vietnam War, French youth began protesting in Paris due to the generational changes of this period. This younger generation's views on memory had no ties or connections to World War II, or no interest in maintaining a positive political image of the occupation during the Dark Years. Many began to question World War II history and the collaboration of the Vichy government. These questions led to the Vichy syndrome, which emerged due to particular social conditions and led to doubtful views of French military roles in the Allied war effort. became an integral part of changes in France's positive war image. Till 1969, World War II memory focused on the view of a glorious France through the elevation of French heroes. The effects of literature and film affected debates of the Vichy syndrome, which questioned its legitimacy. One example was a documentary film by Marcel Ophüls, The Sorrow and the Pity, filmed in 1969. This documentary debunked the Vichy myth by showing the willing collaboration of the Vichy government through oral interviews. These interviews showed that the self-liberation and resistance myths were used to project a positive identity to a domestic and international audience and provide a bedrock for France's post-war national cohesion. The generational changes of the late 1960s, a Holocaust memory boom, and a large set of social changes of the 1970s contributed to the weakening of these myths and began to reinforce popularity towards the history of French memory. As it did so, the image of the hero gave way to that of the victim. One example to highlight is the May 8th commemoration, which has had difficulty maintaining its place in French memory. This commemoration was originally minimized by Charles de Gaulle himself as a secondary significance. This was due to the French government not wanting to celebrate a victory in which they played a minor role. In 1959, de Gaulle abolished the official holiday mainly because it was an event perceived to minimize the weight of France's war role. But the celebration was for particular circumstances, such as the 20th anniversary of the German surrender in 1965. In the 1970s, the sidelining of May 8th continued to maintain good German-Franco relations in an attempt to hide the memory of the dark years. May 8th was a disappointment to many French veterans. Not until 1981 did the celebration become law as a national holiday, which continues today, allowing the separation of France's World War II memory from its World War I memory. The memory at this time began to center on the acceptance and reconciliation of the dark years, as history was becoming the focal point over myth. Examples of this include changes towards the memorial approach and remembrance to the Normandy landings. At the 40th anniversary of D-Day, President Ronald Reagan's Boy of Point Two Hawk speech used America's good war memory of World War II to promote a positive view of the Vietnam War by redeeming America's value in its military. This commemoration politicized the D-Day memory, which became a continued tradition by other American presidents. It strengthened American-Franco relations, bringing D-Day and other celebrations to the forefront of France's World War II memory. It helped to reinforce French national identity, as both national memories became connected through D-Day. The increases in French tourism resulted from these D-Day commemorations and added to the acceptance and reconciliation of French memory. The memory boom of the French civilian experience gained respect among French memorialization, including the rise of many museums and monuments from the 1980s to the present. Even today, the interest and connections to history have become the norm since the 1980s as the increase in respect towards British, Canadian, American, and Polish soldiers demonstrates the regional interest and appreciation of French liberation. The sacrifices of these foreign soldiers can be seen throughout Normandy in these meaningful tributes, as the construction of monuments continues to honor them today. The memory and trauma of Normandy has continually surfaced in political, economic, and social arenas, first figuring prominently in local remembrance during the post-war period, but then evolving into repressed underground expression as French memory shifted as early as 1984. France's World War II memory has similarities and differences when compared with other Allied World War II nations. One example is the Soviet memory of World War II, known as the Great Patriotic War Memory. Soviet World War II memory focused on creating a memory to unite the country in the post-war years, similar to attempts made by the French government to unite France during its reconstruction. Both countries covered up their failures to promote victory. France covered up its failure of the dark years, and the Soviet Union's Great Patriotic War Memory was influenced by the country's politics that meant to secure the power and prestige of Joseph Stalin. The difference here is that France attempted to find itself by creating a national identity and a positive image of itself on the world stage through its use of resistance myths and covering up of the dark years. As both may have focused on the joyous triumphs of the war, the Soviet memory focused mainly on the country winning the war as a whole rather than individual exploits, while France saw many individual triumphs through its resistance myths. What these nations share is the phenomenon of collective narcissism. People dealing with these memories or creating these myths will always overestimate their roles within the war. The memories of World War II can be emotionally charged. Both countries needed to focus on the positive sense of victory rather than their failures in the war to rebuild their national unity and present themselves positively on the world stage. The influences from U.S. and British memories and French memorialization are seen primarily through many commemorations of the Normandy landings from the 1980s. This memorialization helped to rekindle and solidify interest in the history of war that assisted in debunking some of the myths of earlier French memorialization. Understanding the narrative of the people of a country can help us understand their perceptions of current events and how they are likely to act in the future. The evolution of memory shows how the overall meaning of World War II was rediscovered and utilized. As memory became politicized through the 50s and 60s, the shifts in government tended to shatter coherence of national memory, while effects of the Cold War and changes from decolonization had added to national divisions that further divided a national identity. This politicized memory attempted to reunite a country that was trying to rebuild, while also attempting to establish international prestige and a sense of national pride. This resulted in the creation of myths that promoted heroics of the resistance, while also obscuring the realities of collaboration and covering up the humility of the dark years. This lasted till the 1970s, as generational changes and changes in society allowed the French memory to evolve and move to a modest memory of acceptance and respect, while incorporating history into the record of collective and national memory.